That lasted, of course, for some time after the war. Died relatively rapidly during the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War, but for some time. And remembers that in the immediate post-war period, in the election which saw Labour come in, Clement Attlee replaced Churchill as Prime Minister, 2 communists were elected, including in the part of the world that I grew up in Fife, where Willie Gallagher, who was a communist, was elected again, having been elected even before the war, and remained as an MP until 1950, and Phil Pyratin was elected for one parliament in Bethnal Green. Bethnal Green was then a centre of Jewish emigration, and there were lots and lots of pro-communist Jews, big communist party, and the mixture of the Scots mine workers and the Jewish East End put 2 MPs, communist MPs, into parliament, so that the lustre of the Soviet Union and the lustre of Uncle Joe, as he was generally known, a benevolent man with his moustache, lasted for some time. He wrote in this piece, which is quite often quoted, I think sometimes at ceremonies of the Orwell Prize, he says, "I'm well acquainted with all the arguments against freedom of thought and speech, the arguments which claim that it cannot exist, and the arguments which claim that it ought not to exist. I answer simply, they don't convince me that our civilization over a period of 400 years has been founded in the opposite notice. For quite a decade past, I have believed that the existing Russian regime is a mainly evil thing, and I claim the right to say so, in spite of the fact that we are allies with the USSR in a war which I want to see win. 1. If I had to choose a text to justify myself, I should choose the line from Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty. This emphasizes the fact that intellectual freedom is a deep-rooted tradition without which our characteristic Western culture could only doubtfully exist." And then he ends with the famous sentence, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." Masha said that we should talk about present-day Russia and what Orwell means to present-day Russia, and I think that would be very interesting, a way of keeping it forward, or putting this forward. One has to say that the kind of things that Orwell describes, this sort of inability of the intelligentsia in the West, in the UK, as he was writing, to tolerate criticism of the left, is largely gone, I would say. I mean, others may have different views, but to a large extent now, criticism of left by the right, of right by the left, of the right by the right, of the left by the left, is now so much part of our culture that it ceased to be anything to remark on. It wasn't always so in the period after the war. In Italy and France particularly, for many years, until the 90s virtually, France and Italy having very strong communist parties, and the intelligentsia being mainly Marxist, that tradition of seeing criticism of the left, even of the Soviet Union, as being illegitimate was continued, and the intellectual with the highest luster, Jean-Paul Sartre, never a communist himself, would regard criticism of the Soviet Union and even more of Mao's China as being reactionary almost by definition. And I just wanted to add one person to the roll of honor. At the same time as Orwell was being banned by the Soviet Union, there was a great Soviet writer who never saw his work published. That was Vasily Grossman, who was a war correspondent, a distinguished war correspondent, much lauded, like Ilya Ehrenberg, Jewish. And after the war, when there was a kind of anti-Jewish reaction stimulated by Stalin, both these men, by the way, had seen the liberation of the concentration camps, the death camps. He wrote a book over a course of some years called Жизнь и судьба, Life and Fate, which, when the thaw came, when after the death of Stalin in 1953, the thaw under Khrushchev came in 1956, he thought, well, maybe now is the time when this can be published, and he sent it to one of the thick magazines, the literary magazines. to be published, and instead it was not published. It was sent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and the chief ideologist there, a man called Suslov, read it apparently and called in Grossman. He wasn't executed, he wasn't put in prison even, but he was told that this will never be published for 200 years. Why 200? It's still a mystery, but anyway, it would not be published. And Grossman, who was then ill, he died of cancer soon afterwards, was assumed simply that this work of some 10 years was finished, it would never be seen. It was, however, smuggled out by another dissident, I've forgotten who it was, and published in French first of all, and then in English. And it remains, if you haven't read it, maybe for sale in this bookshop, I don't know, it remains one of the great novels of the 20th century. I think one of the greatest. Not in terms of style, it's written in a rather socialist realist style. And it's one of these novels which has got so many Russian names in it that you have to keep turning back to the list of characters to find out who's who. But it as a study of tyranny, and there's a parallel drawn between Nazism and communism in a central scene where a Soviet general is in a camp and is summoned to meet the Nazi commandant, where the Nazi commandant, with clear-sightedness, says, "You and I are exactly the same." The Soviet general won't accept this. We're the same because we both serve totalitarian regimes. And whichever one of us wins will see that regime command large parts of the earth. Now, even with a thaw, that could not be published. And so Grossman never lived to see it published, but it was published later on during the glasnost perestroika era of Mikhail Gorbachev, and took its place as part of the great anti-totalitarian literature of the Soviet, of the world. So, thank you, and maybe we'll have a discussion.